I'm Peter Murray. I'm co-founder of New London Architecture, which is a centre for architecture, but also a network of professionals, politicians and public, which talks about and discusses, debates the changing face of London. I was a design advisor to both Boris Johnson and to the current mayor, Sadiq Khan, and much involved in design reviews of projects which the mayor was connected with. And I'm also the chairman of the Temple Bar Trust, which looks after the only remaining historic gateway to the City of London. Well, London was first founded by the Romans as Londinium in the 1st century AD, and it has developed ever since in different ways. In the medieval period, it became a very successful trading port, and we developed a medieval ground plan, which actually remains quite much the same in the central area. We had the Great Fire of London in 1666, but the merchants were so keen to get back to business that they didn't want a new grand plan. They didn't want to hang about while that was negotiated, and so they rebuilt all their premises on the same ground as it was before. That means that our central business district, the City of London, which is a major financial centre, still operates out of a medieval ground plan, but has contemporary buildings within it. In more modern period, we've had an elected mayor since 2000 who defines a London plan. And the London plan basically talks about how the city will develop over the next 20 to 30 years, of which one of the key policies is that the development for London should take place within the boundaries of the Greater London area. And London is actually also then surrounded by a green belt where development can't really take place in any positive way. So it means that the city has to densify in order to accommodate a growing population. We're growing at around 100,000 new people per annum, and we're going to be over somewhere about 10 million by 2030. So we need to build quite a lot of housing to accommodate those, and indeed all the related facilities that go with that. So the mayor has a policy at the moment of around 66,000 new homes, but unfortunately we're not quite building that many at the moment. Well, we're all trying to work out what the impact of COVID and more working from home is going to be. And it seems as though we are settling down into something around people coming into the centre around 3 days a week, Monday, Tuesday. Mondays are growing a bit, but Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays are the busier times. Friday is a write-off as far as coming into the centre. So in terms of the central areas of London, the West End and the City of London business centres, then they are trying to define how they get more people, different people into the city, more visitors, tourists, people who will keep the retail and the hospitality businesses going. Well, actually we're seeing a resurgence of outer London towns who are now, might say, growing in confidence, having lacked real investment for many years, they're now seeing a resurgence of people spending more time at home using local cafes, hospitality, and actually being present more than they were when commuting was more popular 5 days a week. Well, that's often quite difficult to know precisely what all planners are going to, because we have a London plan which sets the tone for the whole city in terms of general targets for housing and so on, and then local areas, boroughs themselves, and we've got 33 different authorities that control the actual planning system within it. So there are some boroughs, particularly in outer London who are not very keen on development at all. It's a place called Bromley, which is one of the biggest boroughs in London, has the most amount of land, and they don't like development at all and try to restrain it. Whereas there are other central London boroughs, and one called Tower Hamlets, which is actually geographically the smallest, but actually has more towers, more density, great higher population than anywhere else. So there are subtleties across the city which change it at ground level, you might say. But the sort of basic thrust of the London plan is to create a city based on what Mayor Sadiq Khan calls good growth, which is about a city of equity, diversity and accessibility, and a city which looks to improve conditions for those at the moment living in poorer parts of the city. And although London is London-wide, it's a very wealthy city, and we actually do support the rest of the country in terms of the wealth that, in terms of taxation, which comes out of London. But we also do have a number of very poor boroughs as well, which are even compared to cities outside London. And so the difficulties of delivering affordable housing in those sorts of areas is very complicated and been made more extreme in the last year or so by increased interest rates, increased costs of construction, inability to find contractors for particular projects. And so viability of affordable housing is very problematic at the moment. Well, I think one of the key drivers of London is that it's an powerful economic centre. It's a global city, and to a certain extent, maintaining its global city is very important for its economy. And although I mean, as I was saying, back to medieval period, London was always a trading city. So it's always looked outside itself. And of course, during the 18th and 19th century, let's say the British Empire, it drew in a lot of wealth at that particular time. So it has international connections. But the idea of the global city really emerged from thinking around people like Saskia Sassen coming up with the idea of the global city, and so her book really influenced a lot of thinking in London in the 1990s as to how London is situated against other major, particularly financial centres. So the idea that it would have this global connection in terms of timeline from Tokyo to London to New York made a sort of 24-hour operating global financial services system, which drove the growth of the economy, particularly after 1986, when the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, deregulated the banking services in London, and that meant there was a huge influx of banks from the States, Japan, China, and so on, which came into London and changed the economy. Because at the beginning of the Second World War, the population of London had reached 8.6 million. After the Second World War, there was a whole new planning policy where density was disliked, and the planning regime was that actually there should be people should be given the chance to live in new towns out in the greenfield sites outside London, and that actually reduced the population to by about 1 million or so, and actually meant that London was in decline over those periods, and that the Big Bang, the deregulation, started off this change where it started to grow again, and it only got back to being 8.6 million in 2016 actually, and now it's growing up, and it'll be 10 million by 2030. The 15-minute city, I think, is something which is obviously very relevant to polycentric cities, and obviously a lot of cities are polycentric. London's has emerged as a polycentric city, slightly differently because of its history. That we had a early core, which then we didn't start expanding out from that until the 17th century. But by that time, there were quite a lot of established towns and villages out in what was then the countryside. And then over a period of time, over the 18th, 19th century, all those places grew until it formed this rather large and messy conurbation, but with these quite solid communities within them. And so today, there are a lot of places which are pretty well 15-minute cities, and 90% of Londoners are within a 10-minute walk of their high street or main street. So it has been, I think, a 10 to 15-minute city for quite a long time. And if you also include ideas around active travel, which are very prominent at the moment in the mayor's policies, if you cycle somewhere, a 10-minute walk takes 3 minutes, so you actually have a lot more flexibility. So one of the key mayoral strategies around active travel is that at the moment about 60% of journeys in London are carried out either walking, cycling, or by public transport. And in fact, in the centre, in the City of London, about 93% of people go into work by train and walking, or train and cycling, or some of them cycle the whole way. And that really does shift the dial in terms of how you actually create accessibility to services, schools, and all the things which were seen to be very important, particularly that it became popular through ideas well, it was popularized by Carlos Moreno, who was looking at Paris. And Paris, of course, is a very different sort of city than London, where it has this very dense but wealthy core, and a lot of impoverished banlieue around, and they needed to rebalance the city in a way that London hasn't had to do. It's very interesting discussing at this conference about transit, because of course in places like Miami here it's relatively new, whereas in London the Metropolitan line, it was in the mid-19th century, was carved through to create access into business centres. And so to a certain extent we're into adapting systems which were developed for a different sort of city. For instance, we are very much a radial city, because that's the way the Victorian infrastructure builders created, everything coming into the centre. What we lack actually is radial connections, particularly around outer London boroughs. And so the way that is being helped by finding, might say, old railway lines, some of them which have been out of service. You can find those and start connecting them around. So in sort of 2005, we had the first stages of an overground rail line which started connecting orbitally, and more work's being done now on finding spaces where that can be created to connect boroughs around the edge in a way that at the moment car driving is almost the only way to do it. Then we had and been promoted for quite a long time what we called for a long time Crossrail 1, because that did actually describe what it was. It went right across the city, now called the Elizabeth Line, hugely successful in creating opportunities further out from the centre in terms of development. Very popular. Many more people have used it than anyone expected, even post-COVID. And one of the interesting things about the development of that was that it was, when they started planning it, it was very much planning outside the red line of the station itself. So there's a lot of public space improvements that have happened in the areas around it, quite a lot of development too, and more development is happening. So you take somewhere like Thamesmead, which is a city to the east of London, was a new town really back in the 1960s, failed because of its lack of good communications into the city. Crossrail, Elizabeth line goes out to Thamesmead, and that is now pushing through a major multi-billion pound development of that whole area to both improve the existing housing but also a lot of new development. And then one of the things that has actually happened quite recently and almost fortuitously, in that we have Transport for London, which looks after basically the underground systems and the buses, and then we have Network Rail, which looks after the national rail system. And quite by chance, the chairman of Network Rail happens to be in a previous life was the Commissioner for Transport for London. And now, after many years, these two organisations are actually coordinating on sites they have, because those sort of transport authorities have lots of pockets of land which they find very difficult to use, and to develop, bring them together, you have much greater potential. And that's I think generating a real shift to how we actually create higher density around some of the particularly outer London transport nodes. Very radical moves that our first elected mayor, Ken Livingstone, who was elected in 2000, he brought in the congestion charge into London, which actually did just charge motorists to drive into the centre of town, and that had the effect of reducing the number of cars moving into centre by about 30%. It had a big impact, reducing congestion for quite a long time. That benefit from reducing congestion has been lost in recent years, partly because of the growth of traffic, because of small-scale deliveries, a lot of construction as well happening. So during the day, actually, most of the traffic in the centre are trade vehicles of various kinds, very few private cars. We have, over the last few years, been putting in slightly larger and larger ULEZ, ultra-low emission zones, and this started off just in the city core, now has spread right out to the fringes of London. It was put in the centre without really a great deal of debate, but when you get in, as I say, out of London, you need a car really to travel, particularly orbitally, and that has actually produced quite a lot of reaction from motorists and tradespeople there, and has become a highly charged political issue, which I don't think we've heard the last of yet. And I think as some of the councils around there take note of their electorate, we might see some alterations to that. But those have been policies to, might say, tame the motor car, and along with that, there's been quite a large program for the last 20 years, increasing the amount of cycleways, which used to be called cycle superhighways, and that was misinterpreted by a lot of local communities, thinking they were just full of lycra-clad cyclists pelting along at 20 miles an hour to get into work in the centre. But actually the name has now changed to, let's say, alter the brand into cycleways, so that they are actually designed for local communities, for school children. Young school children can actually use them to get to school, as well as for commuters. Oh yes, I mean, there's been a huge increase in cycling. I read somewhere only just a couple of days ago that the Commissioner for Walking and Cycling had suggested about the 1.2 million people cycle in London every day, which is quite a chunk. You will find some streets in London where actually the number of people in rush hour travelling along the route is greater than those people in mechanised transport. And some of the really very positive piece of infrastructure now, after some of them only 4 to 5 years old, are so busy that you feel they're going to have to be enlarged, really. There is a route which comes over one of the bridges, Blackfriars Bridge, into the City of London. You go there at 8:30 in the morning, and there's cyclists from one end of the bridge to the other. Well, of course, we don't really have zoning in quite the same way as happens in the States. I would say that there has been definitely a change in the way that some parts of London see their land usage, and some are really doggedly sticking to what they had in the past. And for instance, I would take the City of London, for instance, which is central business district area. Has some residential. It has a commercial centre, which, and indeed the London plan suggests that it is inadvisable to put too much residential within commercial areas. But the City of London is in a position at the moment where it has a lot of new development. There are new towers being built. There's about a dozen in the pipeline, which are leasing quite successfully, and people are seeing this, what they call the flight to quality, which means that people are wanting to occupy tall towers which are, they're greener, more sustainable, they are healthier, they are designed for, let's say, modern use, which is going to leave a certain amount of, I'd say, stranded assets, and then what those are used for will be very interesting. The City of London authorities, the Corporation of London, not keen on more residential, but I think we'll see when it comes to it whether in fact residential probably the only use for that scale of buildings which will be left empty. Well, I would say one of the most obvious problems of the housing crisis at the moment is affordability, particularly for younger people. Now, you talk to people, architects' offices, people are commuting in 3/4 of an hour, which is quite a long time for London, and complaining about the fact they can't find anywhere close to their offices. And you also see young families moving out of London altogether, actually, in order to find the space that they want. I would say, so there is a affordability problem for what I would call that sort of middle level of young professionals and so on, who traditionally would have been able to afford to live in the city without great problems. I mean, when I moved to London, it was not an issue at all in terms of finding the rent, even as a student. But I would say there is another sort of more deep-seated problem. There are a lot of people in lower income groups where the local authorities are struggling to provide sufficient numbers of housing and at sufficient affordability. And so what is the solution? I was on the board of one of the boroughs in Barking and Dagenham, which is in east of London, is one of the poorest boroughs. They had a very successful way of delivering affordable housing, looking at almost as an asset class, just building affordable housing, looking at the longer term. Very successful way of delivering it. We were delivering 2,500 homes a year up until the sort of financial crisis created by terribly bad Prime Minister Liz Truss, who collapsed the economy in a matter of weeks, and that meant that all the viability of even a public housing scheme like that, all the sums had to go back into the melting pot and almost rejig the whole way of delivering it. But I would say that there are a whole series of quite complex issues that have to be dealt with in terms of if we are going to do it. I mean, one of the things that was actually put into operation by, again, by Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister was what was called right to buy. That meant that people living in public housing could actually buy their own apartments at a reduced rate. A lot of people did that. But what it did was actually suck out all the available affordable housing that local authorities owned. And I think history has shown that actually the best way to provide housing at the sort of level we need is you have a healthy private sector, but that you also have a much healthier public sector delivering housing than we have at the moment. And I think the solution is that we have to, the government has to invest in the public sector to actually deliver those homes, which it's lost a lot of the skills that it had 30, 40 years ago to do that, but they can come back. I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I think it is one of the reasons why people would vote Labour, really, that they would look to helping those most in need in society. That's what its job is. But you know, one worries that the Labour Party seems to be backtracking on green issues and some of the other things you would have thought they would hold absolutely dear. So I hope so. I hope so. Well, the way we do it now, which I think has been proved fairly successful, is by design review. We used to have an excellent body called the Commission for Architecture and Built Environment, which did an awful lot of good research into how to improve architecture, but it did leave might say, a legacy of the idea that design review of projects at a high level with a very competent design review bodies, and the way it's organized and so on is well thought through. And I think that now you will find that most local authorities who care about these things do have that sort of advice from professionals, not just architects, but engineers, sustainability experts and so on, making sure that design is to the highest level. I would say in London, most boroughs are. I would say there are areas outside London which could learn a lot from the way that things are done in the city. Well, I suppose that that first started back in, may say, the 1970s, when the first thing was done that everyone who applied for planning for even an extension to their home, a sign had to be put outside telling people something was happening, because before that people didn't know. Suddenly something would pop up and nobody knew it was there. I would say that since then it has got better, but it's sort of it's patchy, and that the developers do have to consult local communities, but you often find it's an exhibition in a local library, and it's there, you know, come along at 2 to 4 on a Thursday afternoon, and you know, you go on Friday and you've missed it. It's sort of getting better, because I think that what developers are realizing, that actually if they treat communities in that offhand manner, they find they get a bigger negative reaction as a result. So I think that what I'd say, forward-thinking developers know that they have to really bring local communities with them right from the start. So you will find, you know, there are websites, you know, right at the beginning. There are public meetings to bring people together, and I would say that doesn't happen everywhere, but it happens of what I would call sensible developers, because I think they find that actually they get a better result at the end, and they have a happier community. It's better for their marketing, and I think generally it's something that they need to embrace. And there is quite a lot of work being done on digital means of communicating with wider public, because you know the benefit of actually seeing what something is look like is very good for those people who find it tricky to read plans. I think that there are lots of ideas which are sort of designed to solve what different communities see as key problems. I mean, for instance, just the way that that relationship between developers and local communities, we have had a growing number of neighborhood forums now, which are a nice idea. I guess it's quite difficult for most communities to deliver them, because if the community is going to get involved, they have to have put in a lot of time, and actually they have quite a lot of expertise. So you'll find that across London there are very successful neighbourhood forums, but they tend to be places where there's quite a few architects, few retired planners, and lots of lawyers, and then it works. So how you get that, which I think is quite an innovative way of delivering change, how you get that into all communities is more complicated. One of the aspects that has been looked at is how we densify suburban areas, and that's something which is quite tricky, because people in suburbs don't often like change to happen. And there was a program not long ago, it was called Brick by Brick, and it was organised by one of the boroughs, by Croydon Borough in London. A lot of young architects, innovative ideas of building it on small sites in suburban areas. So there's a small site with 2-storey houses either side, plans to, well, you can densify this, let's put 4 floors instead of 2 floors. And those small sites cause huge ruptions from local communities, and actually had such a large response that at the next election, the new mayor was from a conservative, from the Conservative Party, who actually then stopped that. So now Croydon, they have a policy that actually infill sites like that, the building you put in has to be almost the same scale and so on as the buildings next door to reduce that. So even with, might say, relatively small ideas of just slight densification created huge backlash. So one of the solutions to that was called street votes, where a street would get together and decide how they might develop more dense housing within it. So you could take a 2-storey detached house and maybe put 4-storey maisonettes there, and that would be decided by the whole of the street, and there would be some mechanism whereby any uplift in value of the street, because of the more intense development, would actually revert to the people living in the street itself. So so much of English housing has been driven by the fact that people like to, their pensions are the increase in capital value of their homes, that this was actually making the benefit of taking benefit from that idea that people would see their properties, oh, I can make some money out of this, and that through that they might not be quite so, they might not object quite so much to increased development. Well, I was brought up in the country. I came to London when I was 18, and I found a very good flat actually in St John's Wood, which is in northish London, just next to Regent's Park, because I trained at the Architectural Association, and it was an easy walk across the park, and all the people I shared a flat with studied at the Slade School of Art, not very far. So we were all easy walking distance to where we were studying. But then actually I moved to West London, and I think one of the, London is called a city of villages, and it always surprises me actually how very different places are, from Hampstead to Chiswick, just totally different ways, even the way people paint their front rooms. They are very different. So West London was, I sort of ended up there partly because also it is, I used to live in west of London. That's where my family was, so actually going out at weekends was convenient. So moved to a couple of places in West London generally, but I ended up in a place called Bedford Park. And Bedford Park is actually highly significant planning with Norman Shaw as the key architect, but it was dubbed by Sir John Betchman, leading Victorian, let's say, scholar, as the first garden suburb. So it was a highly influential development, which then had an impact on the garden city movement generally and on the design of suburban houses in Britain, but actually throughout the world, really. It was very important. But for me, one of the things that is interesting in terms of your previous question is that I have walked it from the furthest extremity into our local shopping centre. So it's a 9-minute plan, and Sir Peter Hall, which is one of our, might say, greatest planners in Britain, used to live in Bedford Park, and he always praised its what he called dendritic plan, like tree roots coming into the centre, and so the idea of 15-minute cities was nothing new to the residents of Bedford Park. No, we're a bit sluggish in many ways, but we've been let off the hook slightly by the fact that there was a terrible flood along the east coast of Britain in the 1950s, and that led to the fact that we built across the end of the Thames what is called the Thames Barrier, which is these great gates which come up and stop floodwater coming into the capital. And it's expected that will still will keep London fairly safe until 2075, something like that. Although when they first put them in, they expected to raise them only once or twice a year, and now I think they raise them 30, 40 times a year. So that is getting more precarious. But to a certain extent, that has meant that we haven't suffered too much from flooding. We are seeing certain amounts of flooding because of the storms are much harsher than they used to be, and we don't have the runoff we should. So what we're seeing is what I call sustainable urban drainage, but now is to make it more polite, it's called rain gardens being put in some boroughs, not enough. And to a certain extent, if we'd been quicker off the mark in terms of delivering sustainable urban drainage, we might have avoided one of the major pieces of infrastructure we're building at the moment, which is a huge tunnel or drain underneath the River Thames, which takes the overflow from our drainage system. The drainage system was put in the Victorian period, and at that time was very advanced, but it does mix brown and black water, and so that when now, as I say, we're having sharper and sharper storms, which cause bits of local flooding, but also a lot of runoff, and once the system is starts overflowing, it overflows into the River Thames, and we get quite a lot of pollution on a regular basis into the Thames. Better than it was, but it's meant that we've had to invest in this huge drain, and there are cities, and a place like Philadelphia have been very advanced in terms of looking at ways of delivering a way of getting rid of water without actually having to build great infrastructure, much more better runoff, more sustainable urban drainage. And we could have done that, but the problem is that because we have so many different boroughs, with different views on how to deliver this, it's very hard to get a coordinated London-wide strategy on that. A planner who was giving a talk at NLA talked about London as being the apotheosis of pragmatism, and so that actually, I think, these days is some sort of ability to be flexible in the way you relate to change is really important. I think that's to do with the need to be flexible for successful development, I mean, for instance, one of our most successful developments is King's Cross in London, area around an old station, which has been regenerated. I was probably thought by many to be, at least in Europe, one of the most successful regeneration projects. That was only able to happen because they had a planning application, but they could change it to deal with changing circumstance. And they benefited from the fact that we have the Olympics coming halfway through their planning applications, where that actually meant infrastructure improved. But also at that stage, nobody knew that Google was going to come along, want this huge building, but their planning was such that they were able to amend it and accommodate Google on a site which was going to accommodate a Sainsbury's stores, offices. I compare it to a more, I'd say, dirigiste form of planning, as in Paris. And if you look at the area around Austerlitz Station, where they did the master plan in 2000, they're still building it to the same master plan. It hasn't had that sort of flexibility that London has. So, I mean, London has been a resilient city for many centuries, and I think quite a lot of that is to do with it. It has this very flexible and adaptive planning approach.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Peter. Thanks for all that.
Pleasure.